You never know how close we come in life when it comes to history to dramatic changes in course. What might have been if this person had made a decision, that person had made a decision. We already talked about in a prior video about how Ulysses S. Grant came very close to deciding to stay in Knights Ferry, California, but went on to lead the Union Army to victory in the Confederate War. But what you don't know is a fateful decision that was made that also changed the course of the nation, very likely, and it had to do with the Donner Party and what happened up here on Donner Pass and the resulting tragedy of 1846. Brothers Jacob and George Donner came from the Midwest, and they had a dream of starting a new life in California. There was a lot of excitement about gold being discovered and about opening up the West. And they well, I don't want to say they drank the Kool-Aid, but they sure took the bait on the hook. And they decided to charter a party to come out west to California and start a new life. They were also friends with a man named James Reed, and he's very important in terms of this whole Donner, what I call fiasco or tragedy in history. The Donner brothers they had money, they had done fairly well in the Midwest, and the sense of adventure grabbed them, and they managed to put together a party. And they made one fatal mistake. Not many, but quite a few parties had come across land and actually made it to California. It was a brutal journey. People died in trying to traverse raging streams, and starvation and Indian attacks, and just being lost, and also being dehydrated in the Nevada desert. That was the real killer. Many people ended up caching or burying their goods and hoping to return later to get them. Well, who knows how many caches of goods are still buried out there in the Nevada desert. But they made one critical mistake, actually two critical mistakes on that trip. Number one, they got underway too late in the season, which had them reaching the base of the Sierras in late fall, getting into early winter. And number two, and perhaps more tragically, they were recommended to take something called the Hastings Cutoff. And there was I don't want to say a pioneer or a scout who had written extensively about the best way to get out west, and people consumed that. They wanted to go out west. They wanted to study and find the best way to get out here. Well, Hastings had proposed a shortcut, and I use shortcut quote unquote, because that shortcut was to cost the lives of many people in the Donner Party in 1846. Don't worry, I'm getting to the part with James Reed and how history might have been dramatically changed. Just stay with me. This is once again a story of Abraham Lincoln and how many times he amazingly crossed the history of the 1840s, 50s, and 60s with figures that ended up being dramatic and well known and written about in history, such as the Donner Party. James Reed, who was on board with the Donner Party very early on, packed up his family. But earlier, he had fought with Lincoln in the Indian Wars, the Blackhawk Wars of the 1840s, and they got to know each other quite well, to the point that in 1837, James Reed's business floundered. He had to go into bankruptcy, and Abraham Lincoln was the attorney that helped him straighten out his affairs several times. And in the early 1840s, they were considered very good friends, and Lincoln himself had always had a dream of going out west, especially to California. He was excited about it, but he had Mary Lincoln in his life, Kentucky born and raised, who would have nothing to do with the idea of the discomforts of making her way west and either a ship around Cape Horn in South America or overland through Central America and coming into sailing again into San Francisco, or God forbid, getting on a wagon train and going overland. But just imagine for a minute Abraham Lincoln deciding to come out with his friend James Reed, who they knew well, and had many discussions about life in the West and how Lincoln got so very excited at the idea of coming out to the Western United States, particularly California. Question is, if Lincoln had decided to go and come here to California in that fateful late fall and winter of 1846, when the whole Donner Party was trapped here in some of the highest snows ever recorded, would Abraham Lincoln have even survived? 6'4" and about 180 pounds. I suggest he might have been one of the earliest casualties of the being trapped at the base of what we now call Donner Summit. That party ended up extending over the winter and into the spring of 1846 into 1847. There were various rescue attempts that were mounted. James Reed was a real hero, up and down, trying to bring provisions. Tragedy of one rescue team set out to try to get down to Sutter's Fort outside of Sacramento. They were guided by two local Indian guides. Tragically, the members of the party ended up consuming them in cannibalism for their survival. A real story of tragedy. Do you think Abraham Lincoln would have survived month after month of chewing and consuming buffalo hides and whatever they could find up here? I would argue to you, with his slight stature and size, he probably would have been one of the first casualties of the ill-fated Donner Party. One of those turning points in history that if Lincoln had decided the other way, how the course of America would have been changed. Lucky for us, his decision to stay in Illinois, get into politics, and not come to California can arguably one of those decisions that changed the course of American history. As you look at this pioneer monument that was built years ago, you see a woman, a man, and a child looking westward towards Donner Summit, contemplating their fate of getting across the last big barrier to the promised land of California. How high was the snow in that winter of 1846, 1847? If you look up, the base of that monument is 22 feet above ground level. That was the height of the snow in 1846, 1847. And the main reason that the Donner Party had such an excruciatingly difficult time fighting for their very lives in that fateful year. Any student in school in California in 4th grade is required to study the history of Donner Party, because pioneering was such an instrumental factor in bringing thousands and eventually millions of people to California in search of a better life. They do have a museum here also, very nicely done museum with some artifacts that were recovered at the time that the main bulk of the party got up here in the spring of 1847. They were appalled at the elements of cannibalism that they had seen up here. As you can imagine, nothing in life had ever prepared them for what they were to see. But put yourself in the Donner Party. It must have been horrific. Interestingly enough, the women and children fared much better than the men. they made it through, the majority of them, whereas the men, well, they were probably out there working on rescues and hunting and probably burning a lot more calories per day of the little bit that they could find to eat. Donner Lake is a little over the hill there. They could see fish in the lake, but it was frozen so solid that they did not have the proper means to catch those fish, or they might have survived greater numbers of them.